Hey everybody, chapter 14, lesson 2, and what we're talking about here again, of course, is the life in the early 1950s in America, and what we're looking at is how does the prosperity of America in the 1950s change the way people live, and in this case, it's going to change where they live, how they work, what they buy, and then what happens to their families because they're all doing so much better off than they ever have before, or at least than they had in the last 20 years before that. So remember, we're talking about the 1950s here. It starts with President Truman, then goes through President Eisenhower. And what we're starting with here is to take a look at how more and more people, mostly white people, are living in suburbia. Now, if you don't know what that means, here's a little diagram for you, right? So we have a city in the middle, and that city can be, let's just say it's New York, all right? And then you have the suburb around New York City. These are all the little towns and villages and kind of places that grow up around the city that are near it, like an hour away, hour and a half away. And then once you get past that, you have rural areas like farms. Like, so, for example, this is a rural area that we live in, right? There's tons of farms here, lots of agriculture. You could even argue that as you get closer and closer to York City, it gets more and more like a city, doesn't it? Like as you start going through Central School District and you get closer and closer to York City, it gets more and more like a city. Same idea. City in the center, suburbs outside it, rural outside that. And so what happens in the 1950s is more and more people, mostly whites, are living in suburbia because for the first time, homes are mass produced, and that means that homes are cheap. You know, whether it's a place like Levittown, New York, which is the first mass-produced neighborhood, you can see a picture of it right there. Like all those homes look the same, right? There it is right there, one of those homes that you see in Levittown. What that means is that since they're not as expensive, the average person can afford one of these homes, and that's a big deal. So suburban population will double in the 1950s, while city population only rises like 10%. Now, why were they all moving there? I mean, in part it was because the cities were filled with congestion, they were too crowded, there was crime, but that affordability of homes is a real big factor during kind of this 1950 post-war period. And one of the things that gives people all the money they need to buy these homes is the GI Bill. The GI Bill gave veterans of World War II, veterans of Korea, tons of benefits that really gave a real boost to our economy. Like, so for example, one of those was enrollment in higher education. So you would see, for example, here's World War II, right here. This is all World War II, right? And then we see the GI Bill take off, and woo, look at that. College enrollment goes way, 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 way up. And because you have more and more people in college, you're going to see them getting higher paid jobs, and you're going to see those people actually able to buy a house. And that's a really, really big deal. So if you had to kind of summarize how like the GI Bill and this kind of post-war economy for white people was going, I think what you could say is that there were two real characteristics of the United States economy that in that 1950 time period, which is high income and abundant goods. Because the average American income for a family in the 1950s increases drastically. It triples in the 1950s. That average income goes way, way, way up. See, here's the average income, right? You can see it right here starting off at like $23,000. And by 1960, it's going up, right? So this is, a really good kind of way to look at that. The other thing I think you should realize is that as we're making more and more stuff and people have more and more money to buy things, we start to see more and more people actually use advertising, marketing to sell their products more than ever before. But I don't want you to think these advertisements are like the kind you see today. They're 1950s advertisements when America was sexist and racist. Like, here's one where the wife, because she doesn't store test for fresher coffee, her husband's beating her. Yeah, and that was like an advertisement. Or this one for Van Heusen Oxford shirts. 4 out of 5 men want Oxfords in these new Van Heusen styles. And the 5th guy is a black man who looks like a native. Really? I mean, it's kind of that reality. So you can't lose sight of that fact. I think one of the easiest ways to see how all of this changed in the American economy at the time and American home ownership is to see how society changes as a result of so many more families living in suburbia, having access to a house, having access to more money. One of the things that you'll see happen is a baby boom, and the other is going to be a real change in how it is Americans work, where they work, what they do, all those kinds of things. So, for example, we have more people than ever living in a home, right? So many young couples get their first home ever. They got married at the end of World War II, and now, dun, 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 they're making babies. And this is actually going to be called the baby boom. There's this period of like incredibly rapidly increasing birth rates in the United States between 1945 and 1964, right? So check it out. Here it is, right? This is what it looks like. The 1940s right there, right? And then wham, baby making. And then it continues on into the early 1960s. And so when we have more and more families like this making kids, then the nature of America itself is going to change because we have new concerns as a society with so many new babies. And think about it, right? So many of these new parents are going to want a stable job, a high-paying job, a well-paying job, right? So what you'll see happen is, as the American economy kind of grows in the 1950s, these corporations in America are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they want to be more competitive. So they want to get cheap labor. They're going to expand overseas. And one of what this means is that certain Americans are going to see their opportunities decrease, like factory workers. You know, if American companies are expanding overseas, that's fewer factory jobs for Americans. Those factory workers, they're often called blue-collar workers. They're going to have less of an opportunity. The good news is that the GI Bill was sending a lot of these blue-collar workers to college because they were also veterans. So they were able to get what they would call a white-collar job. More and more Americans, as these kind of farms and factories are getting rid of their workers, they're going to take office jobs. They're going to work in what became called white-collar jobs. And the funny thing about this is even as you have more and more Americans working in white-collar jobs, we're going to discover that many American companies at the time didn't want any one person to be kind of the alpha dog, the dominant person. So they would encourage kind of conformity in the 1950s. And think about it, right? Because a lot of these people that are running these companies, a lot of these new former veterans went to college on the GI Bill, getting a job in these companies. They were formed, they came of age in the military, which also discourages individualism. Everyone should be the same, right? You have a rank, right? All those kinds of things. I mean, is it any wonder that business corporations look like this picture, right? This might as well be like an army office, right? Where everyone's in straight rows and straight lines. And is it any surprise to us then that these companies are going to want to kind of continue the same sort of environment that many workers are familiar with thanks to World War II, right? So it really kind of, I think, makes a real change, right? So what happens to these families then, right? We know that the changes in jobs, we know there's more Americans in the baby boom. What's going to happen to these families? So the last thing to take a look at here then, right, is how are these families changed now that they have all these kids? And what we're going to see is that there's going to be a real emphasis on making society healthier and productive because we have all these new kids out there. We want to make sure they stay healthy, that they get good jobs, that they're productive, and all those kinds of things. And then we have to entertain them, right? Like there's going to also all different kinds of new media take place, like television, 3D, all these kinds of things. And there's going to be some social changes that come about of having all of these older people and then a ton more younger people. We'll see some changes happen with that as well, called the generation gap. And then I think also, of course, it's worth noting that this kind of benefit doesn't extend to everybody in America because it's a sexist, racist America, right? It's a prejudiced America. So there's going to be people left behind in the 1950s that aren't going to do well. Kind of let's break this down in a little more detail, right? There's a number of breakthroughs scientifically, electronic breakthroughs like the transistor. I know it sounds silly, but computers used to be the sizes of entire buildings. Thanks to the transistor, we start to see electronics of all sizes get smaller, 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 until now you've got a little tiny smartphone whose computer is more powerful than the one we used in the spaceship that went to the moon, right? I mean, that's a huge breakthrough. Plane travel. All of a sudden, Americans are able to get coast coast to coast in the same day. That's insane, right, for the average American to do that. Medical breakthroughs change the way we live our lives. There's radiation and chemotherapy giving people who have cancer a chance, at least, at survival, which they never had before. You see CPR and heart valve replacements beginning to save lives of heart victims and heart attack victims, giving them a chance at life. There are all kinds of new treatments and vaccines and tests for really terrible diseases that had terrorized Americans, like polio and tuberculosis, both of which get tests and vaccines to help us prevent them. We start to see new media kind of emerge thanks to these breakthroughs, like TV, which now can take the gigantic movie and shrink it and put it in your home. So you see like famous new shows like I Love Lucy and comedy shows and quiz shows and westerns and all these kinds of dramas that are out there that are becoming incredibly popular. You're going to see, as a result of the TV, movie viewership just go right down into the tank, So you'll see the Hollywood movie theaters try and do new things to keep people coming back, like 3D and CinemaScope, a new way of filming. Like we have IMAX now, right? They just kind of come up with these new novelties to get us to go back to the movies. And here's a funny thing, though. Even with all this new technology, even with radio, or even with television coming, more and more popular, radio becomes more popular than ever before because more Americans can afford a car. And they're driving longer, right? They're driving from their home in suburbia now to their job in the city. And since you're driving longer and you're on the road longer and you have those interstates now to go take vacations on, radio stations are important. So radio stations become incredibly popular since Americans use them for news and entertainment. Yeah, but not all is good. Not all is hunky-dory. Let's just leave it at that, right? I mean, because society will change in some ways. Like, for example, rock and roll. Younger generation, as the baby boomers get older in the 1950s, they start hitting that teen year there in like the mid-50s, late 50s, right? They start kind of getting into that mentality. They embrace a new music that is kind of radically different, right? It's got this heavy beat. It's got kind of this African-American sound to it. It's got this jazz, rhythm, blues feel to it. It's got some country feel to it. But it's got an electric guitar, and that makes a big difference. And you're going to see like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, all these other kinds of cultural superstars come out of rock and roll, and adults can't stand it because it's so different than their Frank Sinatra and their Bing Crosby, right? And the problem is it sells in record numbers. And why? Why does it sell in record numbers? Because teenagers, for the first time in American history, have a little extra money themselves. Because we have families doing so well in the 1950s, they give a little extra money to their kids. And their kids are able to buy their own clothes, buy their own things that they want to do, and that creates a generation gap, a cultural separation between parents and kids. And we still have that, of course, right? This idea that the old people are on one side, the young people are on the other, and everything is incredibly different, right? That there is this generation gap. And in fact, some people are going to really strike back at the way America's become. A group of poets called the Beats, they're part of the Beat movement, right? Because they go to the beat of a different drum, get it? Beat of a different drum, they do the things their own way. I think they're mostly white, but they're writers and artists, and what they say is America it's not individual anymore, it's sterile, everyone conforms, it's just an empty place where no one can be themselves. And this is kind of like a preview of the 1960s that we're going to come up with, because not everyone likes this conformity, kind of society. And so we'll see more of that as we go.